Hi, and welcome to Ones and Tooze, FP's economics podcast. I'm Cameron Abadi, FP's deputy editor, with you in Berlin, Germany. As always, Adam Tooze, FP's economics columnist and Columbia University professor, is with us in New York. Hi, Adam.
Hi, Cam.
So, this is the second episode in our mini-series on Heterodox Economists. These are all pre-recorded as Adam recovers from surgery for the remainder of December and the beginning of January. We started this series last week with an episode on Mikhail Kalecki. This week we'll continue with a discussion about Joan Robinson. And again, the premise of this entire miniseries is that there's an entire branch of economics that tends not to get discussed in U.S. economic policy discussions, offers a completely, maybe not completely, but significantly different vantage point on economics in general and economic issues that come up. And so we thought we'd try to unpack those ideas by discussing some of the major figures in this tradition of economics. Last week was Kalecki, this week is Joan Robinson, and next we'll talk about Hyman Minsky. But to delve into Robinson, Adam, like last week, I thought it would be useful to start with a kind of biography of Robinson. And I'm curious, again, how her biography may have shaped her ideas. And specifically, in Robinson's case, I'm curious if we could describe the circumstances under which she became an economist. Obviously, she's a woman in the early part of the 20th century into the second half of the 20th century. What were the circumstances under which she became an economist to begin with? And how did she come to know and study with Keynes, which she did in Britain, in fact?
Yeah, so Robinson is a truly fascinating figure. She's born into a colonial family at the turn of the century, in 1903 in Imperial Britain. So she's 20 years younger than John Maynard Keynes, who would come to play such a pivotal role in her intellectual biography later on. So Keynes was born in 1883. She studied economics at Cambridge at one of the two women's colleges at the time, Girton, and women couldn't take a degree formally, outrageously, but they could take classes, to attend lectures, and even take exams, I believe, but not receive a formal accreditation. It's really grotesque. She met and married Austin Robinson there, who was also an economist, and his first job was as the economics tutor to one of the princelings of Imperial India. So they then spent an informative few years in India in the second half of the 1920s. They then returned to Cambridge for him to take a job. And she exploded intellectually onto the Cambridge scene, working originally on microeconomic issues, publishing in 1933 as an absolutely path-breaking study of what's known as imperfect competition, and establishing herself in a position such that even the extraordinarily sexist Cambridge of the day couldn't, in the end, deny her a lectureship, which she attained in 1937. By that point, she was a key figure in the so-called Cambridge Circus, which was a group of younger colleagues of John Maynard Keynes, who was world famous as a result of his interventions in the aftermath of World War I. He wrote The Economic Consequences of the Peace in 1919, which was a global bestseller and made him probably the most famous economist in the world. And throughout the early 30s, he was working on the development of his macroeconomic, magnum opus, the general theory. And she was part of the circle of younger colleagues that were working closely with Keynes on that. Many of them postponed the publication of their own path-breaking work so as to clear the space for Keynes to launch his intervention. They all understood, I think, Keynes as the bulldozer, if you like, of a transformation of modern economics. And so, vanities aside, it was important to create space for him to do that work. And she is a key orchestrator of that really interesting, fascinating kind of collective project of work, which is figureheaded by Keynes and, of course, inspired and driven by him. She then, however, encountered the Polish left-wing economist exile Mikhail Kalecki, who we did the episode about last week. And this transforms her because she recognizes, if you like, that there's another current that is also converging on the same general analytic of macroeconomics. So an economics that understands the economy as an interdependent circular flow, not an atomistic collection of individuals arbitrating through markets, but an economy orchestrated through a circular flow of expenditure, which self-sustains but can also become caught in massively dysfunctional impasse. And Keynes derives this from monetary economics. Originally, Keynes is a monetary theorist. Kalecki brings it from the Marxian tradition of expanded reproduction models that came out of the late works of Marx, which was he was himself indebted to 18th century French thought, Quesnay in particular. And Robinson has the brilliance and the breadth of mind to recognize that, oh my word, there's this entire other tradition, which actually, if you're a leftist, has more purchase on the reality potentially because it allows you to immediately integrate issues of class and the difference between capital and labor. And these aren't alien to the British tradition, because where did Marx get his economics from? Famously, he took his philosophy from Germany, his politics from France, and his economics from Britain, from Ricardian economics, from classical economics, from the early 19th century British economists. And so Robinson embraces this, and from the 40s onwards really becomes the living link between the core of the John Maynard Keynes, Cambridge, England-based, Keynesianism, and a whole variety of much more radical political traditions, starting with Kalecki. She wrote about Marxian economics in the 1940s. During the war, she's part of the Popular Front mood of the era. She visits the Soviet Union. And then in the 50s and the 60s through to the early 70s, she begins regularly visiting Maoist China and becomes, I think one can fairly say, an enthusiastic fellow traveler of the Communist project in China, at times an apologist, always trying to make sense of the Chinese developmental path as offering new possibilities. So she, like Kalecki, remains profoundly fascinated by not just rich country problems of development, but also global problems of development. I think it's fair to say that she cultivated a critical position with regard to America's influence in the world, including its intellectual influence in the world and the American appropriation of Keynes. So she was a critic, if you like, of US hegemony in every respect, but also deep within the intellectual canon. So she was somebody who was responding to the intellectual force field of the Cold War in a very vigorous way, pushing back against what she saw as the gross misappropriation of Keynes's thought by America. You could perhaps not expect them to be Marxist, but you could expect them to get Keynes right, and they don't. She coins this phrase, bastard Keynesianism, and has a very powerful voice in the US by way of her sometime student, J.K. Galbraith, who arrived in the UK in 1937, hoping to be tutored by Keynes, who, after the publication of the General Theory, was in poor health. He suffered a heart attack, and so instead was tutored by Joan Robinson. And it's Galbraith that brings Robinson to the US to no lesser occasion than the annual meeting of the American Economics Association to deliver a blistering address from the chair, kind of completing the arc of her transatlantic career. It's fascinating reading Joan Robinson's essays in the 1970s. You really get a sense of this generational shift, because everything about her style, her prose, it's reminiscent of American leftist writing of the late 60s and 1970s. It's somewhere, I'm trying to think of ways to it's probably why pigeonhole? But if you're looking for analogies, it's somewhere between like Susan Sontag and Simone de Beauvoir, but within economics. It's savage, absolutely savage at times, but a distinctively, I wouldn't say it was gonzo or gunslinging, but or Joan Didion, perhaps, actually. It has the voice of that, powerful critic of Cold War American, indeed just Western realities, but from within the economics tradition. Crucially, and to reinforce, as it were, the analogy notably to de Beauvoir, you could say that Robinson's preoccupation is a kind of almost existentialist preoccupation with history. Like her central, it's a metaphysical argument really against conventional economics, is it doesn't understand time, and it doesn't understand historical time, even less than time in the abstract, and it systematically works, and it's at the deepest level. This is where the ideological work is done. It evacuates the possibility of history making again and again and again in its misreading of Keynes and its misreading of economics in general. And so there really is, at a very deep level here, a radical body of thought pushing against the envelope of Cold War economics as ideology. And it's a story about the failure of a revolution. Again, the analogies might be to Trotsky or somebody like that, who diagnoses the Russian Revolution as a failed revolution, right, that ends in bureaucracy. In her case, she's describing a failed economics revolution. She regards Keynesianism as incomplete/failed because it doesn't push through to a radical transformation and in the end becomes captured by Cold War state power.
So yeah, on the one hand, this totalizing perspective that you're describing,
I think that's right. I think that's a really good phrase. It did strike me as like reminiscent of Marxist cultural criticism at time. There really is that totalizing phrase. Is you're not just reading a technical economist, though by word she could do technical economics. She wasn't into math, but she really had an extraordinary analytical mind. But in the essays in particular, she's giving us a total picture of the scene in the early 70s. I think that's a really good phrase.
Yeah, and that does seem indeed quite divorced from our discussions of economic policy these days. And yet also at the same time, there is a phrase that I believe is credited, or concept rather, that is credited to Robinson that does sometimes come up in maybe more technical discussions of economics. And what I'm referring to there is monopsony. And I'm curious first of all, what that concept is that Robinson developed. And I'm curious how that bears on the labor market and kind of the class questions that you were describing that she also had in mind. My kind of delving into it seemed to me like it could be an argument that we would tend not to attribute to a progressive or someone on the left, because it would seem to me to imply that labor could be responsible for inflation and the problems associated with it. But you tell me, what is this idea of monopsony and how does it bear on labor market questions?
So, yes, this is a really fascinating dimension of Robinson's work, which founds her reputation and her career. So it's crucial to understand. And it also has been powerfully influential all the way down to the present day in the US. There's many reasons to be continuously interested in her work, but this one has a particular actuality. So, Cambridge in the late 19th, early 20th centuries was an incubator of two revolutions in economic thought. And the one that you and I talk a lot about is the macroeconomic revolution associated with Keynes and the general theory. And this starts with ideas which are to do with monetary economics and fiscal policy. And the target of Keynes's criticism in the general theory is a thing he calls the treasury view, which is this orthodox, conservative, austerian kind of view of economic policy. That, in a sense, though, was the weaker of the two strands of orthodoxy in Cambridge in the early 20th century. And the stronger strand is the microeconomics tradition associated with Alfred Marshall, the first really profoundly influential professor of economics at Cambridge, the author of The Principles, which is the first profoundly influential textbook. And this is a loose-limbed, it's not yet a formal microeconomics of the type that folks will be familiar with from undergraduate classes in universities today, but it's a market, business, consumer-centered vision of economics and a series of analytics of equilibria, the optimality of equilibria, the way in which markets adjust to various types of shock. And it centers on the idea, canonical is the idea of perfect competition. This is a market where there are so many suppliers and so many consumers that they meet each other in an abstract space in which de facto, for everyone involved, the market is simply the price that you take as a consumer and the price that you have to take as a supplier. And you just simply face the choice, do I buy at that price or supply at that price? So it's a situation in which the market, this abstract thing, which is composed of an infinite number of agents with infinite amounts of information about the world, confronts both buyers and sellers as powerless agents who simply have the choice of whether to buy that good at that price or another good at another price, or to supply that good at that price. And it's a powerful abstraction which has certain very interesting properties that economists like analyzing, but it's also clearly very far removed from the realities of the world. And what it leaves you a bit of a blank on is what happens when you're not in such a situation. And so in the 1920s, a generation of economists set themselves to elaborating this in a critical way and formulated, if you like, the first general theories, not now the general theory of Keynes 10 years later, which was about employment, interest, and money, but about market structure. And the first was Piero Sraffa, who was an Italian leftist exile, closely connected with Gramsci, who established himself at Trinity College and published an article in 1926, which began to pick away at the Marshalian orthodoxy. And what Joan Robinson did was to realize, on her return from India, was to realize the significance of this break in the Marshalian orthodoxy. And that's what she doubles down on in this path-breaking work on the economics of imperfect competition, in which she basically lays out perfect competition as a highly special case of a much more general geography of market configurations in which every conceivable possible alternative combination of relatively few buyers, relatively few suppliers with lots of buyers with, lots of suppliers, and so on and so forth, are laid out as a general analytic. And so the aim is to move from the special case of perfect competition to the general case. And in that circumstance, everything becomes about power. You go from a situation in which both consumers and suppliers have no power, and there's just this abstract entity which is laying down the law, to a situation in which consumers and suppliers, producers, have to be modeled as exercising discrete choices over much more complex sets in which they also can have leverage. And this is the problem of monopoly. An oligopoly, where you have 3 or 4 producers who could then perhaps concert themselves to distort the market. So this is a political economy of markets all of a sudden. It's emphatically more political and raises questions of power. One interesting case, which hadn't been much discussed, was the situation not where you have a small number of producers, because that was a problem in American competition economics and law all the way back to the late 19th century. It's the problem of oligopolistic capitalism in the late 19th century. A new type of problem would be the situation of the monopsonist, where you have just one buyer of services. And that, of course, is particularly important in the labor market, where you can have specialized workers or people who are stuck in a particular location where there is only one buyer of their labor, a company town, for instance, where the company therefore exerts huge power. And what Robinson did was to insist on the significance of this case, notably in labor markets. So in the application of monopoly theory to labor markets had previously been done mainly from the right wing. Notably conservative Austrian economists had argued that trade unions were a form of monopoly and should be treated as such. Their apologists had said, well, there's a monopoly on the other side as well. And what Robinson did was to really crystallize out that idea. And she coined a phrase. She apparently took advice from the dominant, most influential classicist at the time in Cambridge over some high table lunch. She said, hey, classicist, what would you call in Greek a situation in which there was only one buyer? And the classicist in question came up with this phrase, monopsony, monopoly buyer. The guy was Hallward, apparently, and that's what he recommended. The significance of this was for a long time rather buried, because in an age of powerful trade unions, you don't have a monopsony situation. But rather abruptly, in the late 1980s and early 1990s, this whole question of monopsony began to rear its, one has to say, ugly head again. Because in the age of neoliberalism, with the destruction of powerful trade union organizations, this question of buyer power on the part of employers becomes very powerfully salient. And the revival of labor economics in the 1990s in America, around people like Kruger at Princeton, is centered on a Robinson-style analytic of wage setting by employers, because what we were seeing was not inflation in the hot labor markets of the 90s and the early 2000s in the US. The inflation boogie seemed to have been killed, but in fact, relatively repressed wages and consequently a shift in the GDP share from workers to employers, which was profoundly disturbing to people who thought the market operated, generally speaking, in a fair way. And so there is a huge revival in the US in the 90s and the 2000s of this question of monopsony. So much so that even Brett Kavanaugh, the Supreme Court Justice, actually ends up citing monopsony as a principle in a case brought against Apple in 2019. And there has been a whole slew of work by American economists recently, notably on the case of Amazon and Amazon warehouses. The claim of Amazon, of course, is that when it enters a local labor market, it's great for regional development, and they should therefore get tax breaks, and local government should support their decision to invest in a particular location. But if you apply the monopsony argument, what may very well happen, and empirical work seems to show this, is that the location of a large Amazon warehouse establishes such a monopoly power of buying that it tends to actually depress wages. And so this basic analytic of power in the labour market has become truly central to our modern understanding of the neoliberal, post-neoliberal world. It's a kind of ironic, vindication of a Robinsonian thesis, which she no doubt would not have wanted to celebrate. But she did, as you say, also look in a clear-eyed way at inflation and its dynamics. And one of the conclusions of a basic Keynesian analysis of the economy can be, it depends on how you set the model up, but there's certainly ways of setting the model up, which mean that cost-push inflation from the wage side is a reality. And that was something that she was willing to recognize as a consequence of a certain sort of combination between macroeconomic forces and microeconomic forces. And this is really one of the lifelong struggles then in Robinson's thought, is how to link together her first work, which was really, the consolidation of the first Keynesian revolution, which was in microeconomics, with her later engagement with pioneering role and central role in the second Keynesian revolution, the macroeconomic revolution. And much of her writing in the 50s and 60s, which is perhaps the least intensively read, as opposed to the politics of the 70s and the early breakthroughs of the 20s and 30s, is about trying to fashion a growth theory. So that adds a further layer of complexity, a Keynesian growth theory with imperfect competition analytics. And that's, as it were, the full ambition of the Robinsonian program.
We're going to take a quick break here, but we will be back real soon to continue talking about Joan Robinson. Maybe we could take a step back then and consider how Robinson ultimately does relate to Keynesian ideas, because Robinson does argue that Keynes's ideas were misunderstood and misinterpreted in ostensibly Keynesian economic policies, specifically in the United States in the post-war period. There's this phrase that comes up, I don't know if she coined it or it's attributed to her thought, namely bastard Keynesianism, as applied to these ostensible Keynesian economic policies. I'm curious if those misunderstandings trace back to Keynes himself. I mean, in other words, did Robinson maybe understand Keynes in this sense better than Keynes himself? I mean, how should we understand this?
I think what Robinson acutely understood, and it's really a deep point, and this is where Kalecki and Robinson are again so interesting in their respective positions on this revolution in economic thought that's going on. Both of them are so far beyond the petty vanities of academic priority and their understanding of this historical process. In Robinson, it's absolutely explicit. She knew Keynes very well. She knew what a 19th century figure he essentially was. She understood Keynes's desperate struggle to reshape his 19th century origins and to free himself and his class from those prejudices and to create a new kind of economics appropriate to the 20th century. But she also understood that as a necessarily partial, urgent, a project of the moment. And the project of the moment in the 1930s could hardly have been more urgent, because the Great Depression hits and Nazism picks up the answer of full employment policy with Keynesian macro before Keynes can formulate the theory of it. And so progressive economic thinking is in a race against time and a race against the clock. And Keynes chooses to formulate his critique of orthodoxy in terms of the orthodoxy so as to be able to make the most rapid and effective intervention possible. I think this is her understanding and her reading of what Keynes was doing. She subsequently also, of course, begins to learn more about Marxism and therefore can judge even more clearly the gap between what Keynes was trying to do and the position that he came from, because she didn't start out in a Marxism. She wasn't starting out reading Lukács to invoke totality, right? She moves towards Marxism in the 40s and 50s. But this means that she reads Keynes as a time-bound urgent intervention that is constrained by the rhetorical devices that he uses. In other words, he frames his argument very often in terms of equilibrium concepts, which are lethal when they are then reabsorbed back into the mainstream. Because once they're reabsorbed back into the mainstream, a Keynesian analytic that was really about the urgency of a situation of a series of decisions made under massive uncertainty leading to a condition of mass unemployment as a result of the fact that investment decisions are not coordinated in a comprehensive way by way of a perfect market, but simply have to be made against whatever parameters, prices and wages and the expectation of demand gives you at any given point. And then, to your horror, it turns out that the macroeconomic circular flow results in a stabilization at a level which is massively unemployed, right? That's the Keynesian diagnosis from her point of view. It's a, oh shit, we did the wrong thing investment-wise, right? We were driven by our fear of the future to underinvest relative to the flow of savings that then materialize as a result of the circular flow within the economy. And now what do we do? And then we invoke the state to come save us. This was recast by conventional thinking in terms of a general analytic of underemployment equilibrium that could be modeled using the ISLM diagram that was developed very rapidly after the issue of the general theory that then becomes a mainstream teaching tool. And that isn't even the worst thing. The worst thing is that in the force of trying to, in the moment of trying to make the argument, what Keynes invoked was a kind of empty logic of government spending. In other words, any government spending would do to stabilize the economy. And conventional thinking says, right, fine, absolutely, that's great. That makes it easier to model this in abstract terms. We'll just put a government spending item in our equation, G alongside I, alongside C for consumption. And then that can be whatever it likes, right? That can be whatever it likes. And at this point, then Robinson begins to converge with Kalecki, because then you start asking yourself the question, well, what is it that we expect that quantum of government spending necessary to stabilize the economy to be? Oh, God, it turns out to be military expenditure. So from the 50s onwards, she becomes a very acerbic, very, very clear-eyed critic, essentially, of military Keynesianism as the de facto political outcome of an incomplete revolution, which had in its rhetoric paid too much homage to the existing status quo. And in the heat of the moment, and by virtue of the fact that this was being carried out during World War II, had left open the substantive question of what a progressive government spending policy would actually look like. And you end up instead with the military Keynesianism of the 50s, notably in the United States, driving growth, which itself also for Robinson was a new idea. Economists like her, coming out of a mixture of Marshallian economics in the late 19th century and Ricardian economics of the early 19th century, are not fixated on growthmanship, the pumping up of GDP as a goal in itself is a distinctive historical innovation of the 50s and 60s. And Robinson is quite horrified by its vacuity, right? Because it doesn't really tell you about what you're producing or what circumstances you're producing it under, what the distributional bargain is. And as a promise of the end of poverty, it's empty because unless you address both the relative and absolute levels of inequality, you're not actually addressing what poverty is. And so she sees capitalist economies as being caught in this sort of infernal, it really is a critique of ideology, this frame of distorting images which say whatever government stimulus you do will help demand, will help growth, will maintain full employment, will keep GDP bubbling along. And so therefore we've diagnosed and we've absorbed the lessons of Keynesianism. And from her point of view, it's horrifying. And this horror builds more and more over the course of the 50s and 60s, and then gives way increasingly to alarm at the fact that not only is this a kind of horrifying, essentially neoconservative stabilization of the existing state of the Cold War world, it's also failing at an intellectual level. It's not going to be able to explain the new tensions which are driving forces of change within society. And in this address, which J.K. Galbraith invites her to give at the American Economic Association, she says, we should reckon with the fact that we don't actually have an analytic, because we've avoided the distributional question. We don't have an analytic of the inflation problem. And because we've avoided the question of what we're producing, we don't have an analytic of the military-industrial problem, which is at the core of so many critiques of American economic policy in the Vietnam era in the 60s and early 70s. And furthermore, and really interestingly, says we also have absolutely no account of the collateral damage done by our growth, which is the environmental problematic, which is also heaving into view in the late 60s and the early 1970s in the West. And in somebody like J.K. Braith is absolutely manifest. And all of this because essentially we can't grasp. We have taken what was a historically crucial intervention at a moment of crisis for the West, and we have reified it into an empty engine of formalisms. And that empty engine of formalisms has sustained this growth mechanism, but it is not, she says, it's not going to allow economics to avoid its second great crisis. The first was the failure to really be able to offer answers to the questions of the 1930s. And what she's saying is she fears that economics will fail to answer the fundamental questions facing Western societies, advanced societies in the late 60s and early 70s as well. So it's a very powerful, and as you were saying earlier on, Cam, like it truly is a kind of totalizing analytic of how the incomplete intellectual revolution of Keynesian macroeconomics in the 30s and 40s was reabsorbed into a system which then displayed its kind of durable, conservative inner core, both analytically, intellectually, and with regard to the sinews, the tough sinews of power.
I do wonder whether this is the point at which we enter post-Keynesianism. In other words, is this an area where Keynes himself was quite as reflexive and self-aware as you're describing Robinson was about these issues? Is she even advancing his thought beyond where he was? Because it's worth saying he was alive in the post-war period for some time. Was he articulating the same concerns?
I mean, I think Keynes's thought is every bit as wide as Robinson's. But this is the sense in which, he is not Keynesian and she's post-Keynesian, and Keynesianism is this hardened apparatus of the state management of capitalist economies under the conditions of the Cold War. And that wasn't, to be honest, Keynes's outlook in the 20s and 30s. In fairness to him, his own analytic was much broader. I mean, if you remember that conversation that we had in the live show in New York, I waxed lyrical about Keynes's. Ultimately, the yardstick for Keynes of economic policy and social policy is aesthetic, right? Is the shaping of a better society judged ultimately by aesthetic standards. You can't fault him for a narrowness of vision in that regard. That's why I think, Robinson referred to what emerged as bastard Keynesianism. And hers is an effort to escape that, fuite en avant, an escape out of that framework. So I would see her as, and I think, the kindest reading would see her as trying to revive the more unconventional, out-of-the-box, radical vision of socioeconomic thinking that Keynes himself had aspired to. And this is also where the story about the development of economics comes in, right? Because when the Cambridge Circus is doing its thing, this group of young folks around the lead figure of John Maynard Keynes in the 1930s, economics is not what it will become under the massive pressures of Cold War professionalization in the US in the 50s and 60s. It was a completely different business. It was a sort of extraordinarily exclusive elite discourse amongst a relatively small group of people in a few universities in the West. And then it turns out, with the arrival of people like Kalecki, oh my God, there's an entire world of economics out there in Central Europe that's ticking very differently. That comes as quite a surprise. There was also in the 19th century, of course, a German and French tradition. Italians also received, but the Americanization of economics in the 50s and 60s, the Americanization of Keynesianism, I think, is something that you're quite right, is absolutely what the social scientification, the mathematization, the formalization, the crudely technocratic conception of, the manipulation of basic variables in the macroeconomy. All of these are Robinson's objects. These are the objects of her critique.
Well, we should leave this episode off here for now, but the mini-series will continue with another heterodox economist next week, Hyman Minsky. So join us then. Ones and Tooze is written and edited by me, Cameron Abadi, along with Adam Tooze. It's produced by Claudia Tatey, Laura Rossbrow-Tellem, Rob Sachs, and Dan Efron. This show is made possible through the support of foreign policy readers. If you're interested in news and analysis from around the world, consider subscribing. Listeners to Ones and Twos even get a 15% discount. Just go to foreignpolicy.com/subscribe and use the promo code Tooze at checkout. That's TOOZE. And listeners, as always, we love getting your feedback. You can leave voice messages on the Ones and Twos homepage on foreignpolicy.com, or email us, podcast@foreignpolicy.com, or you can tweet us. That's @OnesandTwosPod. Thanks very much for listening, and we'll be back in your feed next week.